Now, I don't know what people should be. Maybe we should be politically obsessed, but I've never found political obsession and incivility to serve anyone's interest personally. So what I've decided to do with my career is whatever's happening out there in the world, I want to teach civility, respect, insight, depth, self-understanding, character. Because in my experience, if people don't work on these things, they suffer unnecessarily.
Hello and welcome back to the Vinny Brusco Show podcast. Hope you're enjoying the show. If you are, of course, spread the word, tell a friend, but also please subscribe to the show. Click the little button down below. Helps with brand awareness, helps with the algorithm, blah, 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 whatever it is. Just subscribe, rate, and review the show right down below. It'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Hey, this is Rabbi Mordecai Finley, enjoying myself tremendously on the Vinny Brusco Show. It's been an honor.
And here we go.
You have a very calm demeanor. Do you get frazzled?
Now and then.
Yeah.
Not too much.
What has led you to not getting frazzled? Is it the mind, the body, or the spirit? Is it the jiu-jitsu black belt in you that comes through in those moments?
Jiu-jitsu white belt. That's the first hurdle, man.
Yeah, it's a cat in a bag, right?
Someone gets on top of you, starts squeezing the life out of you. Stay calm.
You learn. I'm a blue belt under Igor Gracie, right. And you definitely start to learn how to not have that cat in a bag. You're absolutely right. You learn. I'm one stripe on my blue belt, so I would say once I achieved high white belt, low blue belt level, I was able to like, all right, this is where I am, and now try not to die.
Exactly. And you can always tap.
You could always tap. The ego will get in the way of that. But once you learn to check that ego at the door, you could always tap.
Yeah.
It's a great equalizer, jiu-jitsu. I do. It's one of those. So my dad is a Shihan in Japanese jiu-jitsu. And I was kind of contemplating starting that. And I have a few friends that do Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And I reached out to them. And they're like, no, do Brazilian jiu-jitsu. It's obsessive. And the first time I went on the mat, I was like, oh, I get it. Like it was an instant. I'm drawn to things that in theory are endless, like trail running, sensory deprivation, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I'm learning this about myself, Rabbi, that I'm drawn to things that are endless.
Like the meaning of life.
Isn't it? Right? It can go on forever. And then once you reach a certain achievement level, like a black belt, they say that's when you become a white belt all over again.
Absolutely.
So I heard you on the Rich Roll podcast, and the moment I finished that podcast, I instantly thought, I need to speak to this. I need to learn from this man. I need to speak to this man. And I reached out to you, and you're gracious to respond and say, let's put it in the books and let's get it to going. You have a very accomplished life, and you have, in my mind, a balance, and we kind of spoke about this the other day, a balanced energetic chi to you, right? The mind, the body, and the spirit. The mind in the work that you're doing and the guiding that you're providing, the body and perhaps the jiu-jitsu, and the spirit obviously being a rabbi and being under a religious sect, if you will. What came first out of those three? Was it the mind, the body, or the spirit?
That's a good question. I never intended to be a balanced person. I just followed my interest. And I would say, even as a young person, I had what you might call today what I would call now, deep intellectual and spiritual interest. I was also very interested in history. So no one ever had to tell me to read a history book. I had a knack for political science, for philosophy. So I read since I was a kid. And I remember the first time I read something, the Apology, Socrates' Apology. I had no idea that it was ironic, that it was sarcastic.
Right.
The word of apology was a poke in the eye at Athens. And I just remember reading, and taking things deep. I think I've always been interested in physical. I was never like a great athlete. I was good in PE in high school, and when I joined the military, then I found out actually I was capable of excellence in the physical side of things, both physical fitness and all the other physical things I had to learn as a Marine. I think the spiritual, as I mentioned in the podcast, got opened up very deeply when I was in high school, when I had a spiritual teacher who more or less drafted me, and I didn't oppose it. So you might say I found myself being an intellectual, looking back on it, on a spiritual path. Very, when on August 13th, 1973, I was in the physical world. And I never said I need to live a balanced life. I just followed my passions.
I think that's a big part of some of the energetic tightness and the energetic field that we're feeling. You want to call it collective consciousness, whatever you want to refer to it as. I feel as though people are getting away more so now than ever to their internal guide, right? We kind of start to question that. And of course, hindsight's always 2020. And I want to go back into the drafting of you in high school into a spiritual sense. But talk about a little bit of how we as a culture we've gotten away from kind of going inward, and we look for all these external things to kind of give us that dopamine and that serotonin hit that gives us the reward. But intrinsically, when you look at suicide rates, look at depression, and now obviously COVID has kind of magnified those things. When you look at it at the scale culturally, it seems as though we're not going internal, and it's kind of been brushed aside as woo-woo.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very hard to critique culture accurately without vast statistical data. So we're talking about impressions. I remember after the 60s was supposed to be a time of great introspection. It was actually, I think, a very, very tiny minority of people were up in Berkeley or these other places. Most Americans were trying to hold down a job. Some number of them were in the military. It's not as if we became an introspective society. As I tap back into those times and I read Jung, I read so many of the great psychologists, I don't know how many people have been reading them in our country's history. So when I went into that world, and I've been reflective, I was in the military, I found a few reflective people. Now here's the interesting thing. When I went to college and I majored in religion, I met knowledgeable people, but not that many spiritually reflective people. When I went to rabbinical school, I met a few spiritually reflective people. So in my life experience, truly spiritually reflective people have always been rather rare. Now, I going to today, it might be that it's less, and partly because we've been consumed by other things. I'll say for sure, since 2000 with Bush, politics has gotten worse. I mean, the hatred level has gotten worse. The obsessiveness has gotten worse. The civility has almost disappeared. So if people are going to obsess, they typically obsess about political things as opposed to their character, their virtue, their inner lives. Now, I don't know what people should be. Maybe we should be politically obsessed. But I've never found political obsession and incivility to serve anyone's interests personally. So what I've decided to do with my career is whatever's happening out there in the world, I want to teach civility, respect, insight, depth, self-understanding, character. Because in my experience, if people don't work on these things, they suffer unnecessarily. So I don't know about the history of our country and whether people are more or less anything. I'm just living the 4 cubits of what I got to do.
Do you think that it's a distraction to stay away from going internal, kind of putting things outwardly, projecting onto politics or culture or whatever it is, where people don't, it's hard, right? It's an awareness factor, right, that you've had in hindsight throughout your entire life for the most part. And then it boils down to accountability and discipline, right? Discipline equals freedom, right? The old Aristotle. And the idea that it takes that awareness to come up, and a lot of people will kind of brush that to the side because, thinking is a rich man's problem. Right? If all your needs are met, the hierarchy of needs, then you might have a little bit of time to think. But if you're struggling just to get by, right, you're not going to have the luxury of thinking, the luxury of pontificating life. You're kind of in the dire straits. And I feel as though it's a yin and a yang and a balance to culture where there are people that are fighting to survive, but then there's the other end of it where it's just easier to pass the buck onto politics or to Trump or to Biden or to your neighbor or to the person in the line at Starbucks in front of you rather than going inward.
Well, let's break that down. When I look at myself, for example, I'll just give a brief example. When I was in basic training, we were very busy, and it got brutal. But I had the midnight, they call it the fire watch, the midnight guard wake me up. I went into the head and I sat there and I reflected. Now, yeah, we were busy, but I took time at midnight to 12:30 to go in there. In fact, one time a drill instructor walked in on me. He said, "Finley, what the hell are you doing in here?" I said, "Sir, thinking, sir." He says, "Well, that can be dangerous." So, it doesn't matter where a person is. It doesn't matter how hard their life is. Reflection, I think, maybe it's personality, then it's a decision, then it's a skill. It doesn't matter how hard your life is. It really takes, I think, it's an existential act of will to be a reflective, insightful person.
Do you think that a existential crisis has to take place in some way, shape, or form to kind of snap that into action, or is it a slow dimming light for most?
It's in my
Or
life as a
brightening light.
clergy person, I've seen many people awakened into reflection because of catastrophe, because of pain, etc. But remember, I have a particular view because I'm around people when there's a death, when there's an illness, when there's sudden estrangement, and they're trying to figure it out. On the other hand, in all my reading that I've done, there are people for whom the crisis of meaning is internal. They might live from the outside a charmed life. And then just there's an internal process of a person sensing, I have to find the meaning of all this. I have to understand the whys of my own being. So sometimes people are inducted into the world of reflection, insight, wisdom, character, and virtue because of an outside event. And sometimes it's their inner path.
I want to go back to high school because that's kind of a rite of passage time for so many people. And your story of being kind of recruited by what you can call a spiritual guide, if you will. So many young people probably at that stage of their life would have dismissed that. Was there anything that kind of called you to step onto that path that in hindsight you could say that was the moment where I said, oh, okay, this is something I want to embark on? Because essentially it was an introduction onto your own personal hero's journey, right? It was like, come on board, here we go. And at such a young age, I feel like so many young people would refrain from joining that.
That's a great question. I've actually reflected on that ever since I didn't always tell this story. And maybe a decade or so ago, I thought, I'm just going to be open about myself, about my journey, my story. I don't have anything to hide. And let's see how people respond. So I decided to be open about that.
Why didn't you tell the story?
It seemed very private. It was just a part of my life that I, in general, kept private, maybe as just a habit. I told my wife about it within an hours after we met. She had to know who I was. So there are certain moments in my life that have been foundational for me that for whatever reason, I decided not to talk about. And then some years ago, I decided I'm going to tell those foundational transformative narratives. And let me see what happens next. Because I wanted other people who had had those experiences not to feel alone. And number two, there were many people who were interested in it. How'd you get this way? And I thought, let me just put it in the record how one guy got that way. Somebody finds it interesting, great. If they don't find it interesting, that's also fine. So here's one thing that really is a fluke in a way. So I always read. I read a lot of history, and when my sister went to Compton College, actually, we lived in Linwood, but she went to Compton College, and then she took off for Europe, and she left her books behind. So I read Camus, I read Sartre. She had a class in existentialism, and I started reading these books. Nothing like anything. I remember Nausea by Sartre. And I read these books. I just had this sense there's more going on in the world than is happening in California, man. What is up? So,
wow.
So, and I'm not going to not understand these books. So I was in 9th grade and I said, what is this? So I began looking and, for existentialism, and I go to the school library and here and there. And
it's
so
like that scene in a movie. You see the kid taking out books on philosophy, and he's like 13, and the librarian's like, okay, and just like stamping them away.
No, I remember eighth grade, I checked out a book on relativity. Uh, I wanted to know all this stuff. So I had a sense, especially with the existentialism, the sense that
Sure.
we're thrown into an uncaring universe and we have to make meaning of our lives and don't fall into this perspective that I've been born into a world of meaning that structurally precedes me, although I believe that now. I made sure not to believe it then. And then watch myself as a meaning creating person. So this is ninth, 10th, 11th grade. I mean, this was part of my existential consciousness.
Sure.
When the teacher, Jack Bishop, was doing this initial detection, I've described it a few times. I'd be sitting in a science class and he'd be teaching something. And, so I just remember one in particular. He's teaching about the myth of spontaneous generation, how germs and small things come into being and they couldn't account for it. They just said they just spontaneously generate. So you go, da, 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 spontaneous generation. And then looked at me and said something like, but we don't actually know where things come from, and like drills a look into me.
So now at that point, right? Like, is that, and again, in hindsight, it's easier to probably play it out, but in that moment, are you thinking like, am I going crazy right now? Like, because you'll have those moments where they just stand out as, you want to call it the universe, you want to call it whatever you want to call it, the quantum field. And it stands out as, am I going crazy right now? Or am I getting signs from the universe?
I'll tell you exactly what it was. I didn't ask whether I was going crazy. That's a rhetorical question. So
Sure,
I
right.
always train myself not to ask rhetorical questions of myself. But I'd ask myself, is this real?
Right.
So it happened enough times, and I felt that his science questions, he'd look at me, drill me a look, and the question would change its meaning when he looked at me.
Wow.
So I thought, okay, am I making this up or is it happening? So I come after school, I say, can I talk to you? I walk in and I say, sometimes I feel when you're giving a talk and you say things about science and you look at me and the meaning changes. Is this really happening? He says, I've been waiting for you to notice.
Wow.
And then he said, you want to sign up? I said, absolutely.
And it takes so much for a person to, again, have that moment where is this real, right? Is this real? Is this something that is being perceived in my mind, or is this a reality that I'm experiencing, right? And then to go ahead and take the next step and confront and to question that moment, because the other side of that is he says, what are you talking about, right? And that is the juxtaposition of that, right? That's the other potential reality that could have transpired, and that might have set you on a completely different pathway. But you were able to pick up on the feeling and go, well, or you could have done nothing about it and just kept on sitting in class and kept on questioning it. But to step into the space and say, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put this on the table, and it is what it is at this point.
And reflecting, trying to account for myself. And remember, we're ultimately not problems to be solved, we're mysteries to be encountered, including the mystery of the self. But as much as I try to account for it, I think because I began reading different kinds of philosophy, including Steppenwolf, for example. There's another book my sister left behind. Just reading Hermann Hesse, and then I read other books by Hermann Hesse. I knew there was a world of mystery. I knew that there was a mystical background to reality. So I think my readings in existentialism in 9th, 10th, grade had already prepared me. Vinny, I don't know if I ever even talked about this with anybody, to tell you the truth. I mean, I may have tried to talk about it with my mom, my dad, and didn't get very far. And I don't even remember having discussions as much as I had a profoundly deep internal world that was more or less private. So when this began to happen to me, I had a sense of what this was. He stood for a mystery. He was asking questions that evoked the mystery. I just want to go check it out. And then when he said, I've been waiting for you to notice, I've been waiting for you to come to me. And he told me a little bit about what's up. And he said, in or out, in some way. And I said, in. And he said, okay, we meet every Wednesday afternoon in my classroom.
This is the Morpheus and the Neo, the red pill or the blue pill moment.
Yeah, I've seen enough movies that describe this moment that either the writers have gone through it or they know about it. But there is that moment of spiritual induction. And I was inducted into the fellowship.
Wow. What an age, right? What a time, a transformable time. Like my sister left behind Bush Razor Blade Suitcase cassette and like Green Day. I didn't have books on philosophy and psychology and introspective thought. So from there, you're now kind of brought onto the path of we'll call it the hero's journey. You're brought onto the path of self-discovery. You're brought onto the path of, call it spiritual awakening, finding the God within, whatever you want to frame it. And where are you going now? Like obviously, some years later, you joined the military, kind of
Right.
a similar ilk, right? Like kind of on the similar guides of trying to discover yourself and kind of touch on that a little bit for me.
Well, I wasn't aware of the idea of the hero's path until much later. So I didn't feel I was on the hero's path. I just felt I was trying to understand reality, including spiritual reality. I had a great teacher. He had a great way of asking questions, providing insight, and the only way I could authentically respond was to expand my consciousness. Every time we met, I was being tested, and I was being developed because there's sometimes when I'll ask a person a question, and I can see have they regressed to old stuff,
Mm.
or have they taken the question, which is an invitation, to break through rigid consciousness and go into the mystery of the unknown. I can tell by the answer.
Wow.
And so when I went in there, every time he'd ask me something, I realized the only way I can respond is to expand my consciousness. And he did it. It's almost like a physical workout. You want to build a muscle, you got to start with a certain kind of weights and a certain regimen. And I just felt my consciousness expanding every time I sat with him. So I didn't have a sense I was on a spiritual journey. As much as, Vinny, not even very reflectively saying I've turned a part of my life over to a mentor. But I never consciously did it. He said, "You want to learn?" I said, "Yes." Show up at Wednesdays after school. I said, "Okay." Sat down and did it. I actually thought, all right, this is what I do. Where are you Wednesday afternoons? Over in Jack Bishop's classroom. That's what I do. What are you doing in there? I start to explain it. They say, "Okay, retract my question. I don't want you. I don't know what you're doing there. I don't understand what you're doing in there. Is it safe?" It really feels really safe. It feels really good. My friends kind of knew about it. My parents knew about it, but nobody understood it. And it was like, okay, that's Finley. He's kind of always lived in this other world.
Were you like that as a kid? Were you always kind of in your own like I would and I see this now having children, I see my daughter, she's 6 years old, and I'll ask her like, if you could do one thing in the world, like if you do one thing every day or all day long, what would you do? And her response is, I would play with my dolls. And I'm like, well, why? And she says, because it's my own world. And I was like that. Like I was very much, you could leave me in my room for hours and I'm either drawing or I'm playing with my action figures and I'm creating something and just, were you like that as a child?
That's a really great question. I've never been asked that question. Now that you mention it, look, I was a reader, so I lived in the world of books, but I also
Right.
played one. I had my buddies out in the street and we played street football and we went on adventures. So I wouldn't say I was one or the other, but when I was at home, I read books, and I also, this is back in the 60s where they had what we call army men.
Yeah.
So you had German army men, American army men, Japanese army men, and I read about battles in my history books, and then I would stage the battles in Ardennes,
Yeah.
and I would have incredible battles going on, and I would read the book, and I would move the troops, and then, my family would, like, I think my older sister would come in, they like move somebody, and I go,
Did you
okay,
notice?
who moved him? I had like 1,000 characters on the floor, and I knew every one of them was.
Who moved the general?
Exactly. No, I said, who moved John? It was down to who moved John.
Who moved Sergeant John? Right, right,
Yeah,
right.
there you go. So I'd had that, and then I was done with it. I became a teenager and bagged up the army men and
Sure.
did teenage stuff, but I never stopped reading and reflecting. So I wouldn't say it was compartmentalized. I think it was just my development as a human being. I had my buddies, I had my friends, I had high school, I had all the normal stuff, and I had this other thing.
And now, so then you obviously high school ends, and when did you join the military?
So that actually is really part of the journey, and I can't quite account for it. And that was Jack Bishop had alerted me to a world within that was demanding, and for lack of a better term, pure. And I looked at my life as a Southern California high school kid. Sometimes we would say in 1970s is the revolution ended and all we got was the drugs.
Right.
So society had fallen apart and we were just living in the shattered pieces. And So there's just a meaninglessness about parties, smoking pot, hanging out, this and that. And I just thought, wow, this is not who I am. Meaning this deep thing. And I thought to myself, I need to purify myself.
Wow.
I thought about it and thought about it. And I had my sister's husband was a Marine. He did 2 tours in Vietnam, and he and I were close. And I read, and he left the books. He left Helmet for My Pillow by Robert Leckie. So he left a bunch of Marine Corps stuff, and I read this stuff, and I was just fascinated with how hard the Marines were. And they're not good fighters like their physique. It was, I'm not retreating.
Right.
So a core moment in American history was August 22nd, 1942. 1st Marine Division. They're all a bunch of draftees. They've never seen action, but they were Marines, and they were on Guadalcanal. And the Japanese, who had never really suffered a defeat, were rushing down the beach, screaming with their swords out. And these 18, 19-year-old kids just held the line. And as I read Robert Leckie's book, Helmet for My Pillow, he wrote, it never occurred to us to retreat.
Wow.
Because we were taught to stand and die. And that just spoke to me. And so when I read Robert Leckie's book and other books about the Vietnam, the idea of, I will stand and die. I will hold the line. I will die here doing my duty. It spoke to me in a deep way. And also just the rigor of Marine Corps basic training, it spoke to me. So when I realized I'm not going to go to college. I got to get out of this high school mindset. I have an inner life that has to be expressed. I have to purify myself of all this adolescent silliness. And I just distilled it and said Marine Corps, especially Marine Corps basic training. I'm astonished at how wise I was for an 18-year-old kid. I had no idea that it was exactly what I needed and has paid off in spiritual fruit and nourishment my entire life. It was as if a miracle happened to me.
How many of like-minded individuals at this stage or going into the Marine Corps have you come across?
Okay, so you'll find this fascinating. I'll tell you, in boot camp. So without going into too many of the stories, one of my drill instructors was doing the Jack Bishop thing.
Now, did you have the moment where you're like, this is the same thing that was happening in high school? Like, so now
I thought they followed me. I remember thinking, they have followed me here.
Wow. So again, is this real?
He calls me in, does a little bit of those test questions, and he looks at me and he says, Finley, how many Marines do you think there are like you? I said, sir, 1 in 1,000? He said, 1 in 10,000. He said, the whole time you're here, you'll have to wear a mask.
Wow.
I
So
said,
you're going into the Marines to essentially shed the mask, right? That's you're going into
shed everything.
Right. Really, realistically speaking, shed everything and really embrace what you're feeling inside of you. And now you get there and and they tell you the opposite. It's like, no, now you have to put in this whole other mask.
It's so fascinating because because why was I there? To shed everything but the light.
Right.
And they strip away everything. And so he saw the light. And he said, you'll have to mask that light. They're not going to understand it here.
Wow.
So that's what he was telling me was, don't reveal the light to the wrong people. The senior drill instructor who really didn't like it, because one time when he was like really giving me a hard time, he said, Finley, you're only 90% in. I said, sir, yes, sir, because it was absolutely true. I was never, sold. I was like, I made sergeant in 30 months. I was an outstanding young Marine.
But you were an outstanding young Marine with the wherewithal of the bigger picture.
I was there. Life. I'm a patriot. I want to serve my country. I want the GI Bill for all the other reasons. Part of it was there. Part of it, a significant part. The main motivation was to shed everything but the light. So Sergeant Throneberry looks at me and says, you'll have to wear a mask. I said, sir, yes, sir. And I didn't realize he was going to follow up on that and take me in as a student in boot camp. Okay, so these are some fascinating stories. But so he more or less says, here's what's up. He says, now, one last thing. He says, we're not going to become friends. Do not go looking me up, because if I have to send you to die, I will. Wow. I said, yes, sir.
Wow.
He came back from Vietnam. I said, sir, yes, sir. And so time goes on, and then he tells me to report to the duty hut at, like after lights out. I go in there, and there's 3 other Marines sitting on the floor, and he says he's going to impart to us, his name was Robert Throneberry, I'm going to I'm going to teach you the Gospel of St. Bob. So we took out our little Marine Corps notebooks and we took down the Gospel of St. Bob. This is in boot camp.
That's amazing.
It is, huh?
That it really, like, having, you couldn't script that. Like, that's so, and like you said, like that moment, you're like, they followed me. Like, it's so surreal. It's so out of just, you know, my moment of that in my personal life is, you know, when my daughter was born, my first child, and I walked into the room and I looked around and I was almost expecting them to like move the set and be like, all right, and scene, Vinny, we're going to hand you the baby now. And then you're going to rock it. And mom, you're going to be crying. Like, and nurse, you're going to come over, we're going to take the footprints. It was so out of time and space and out of body. Exactly right. Yeah. And then to have that and be like, is this happening again?
Yes, except I have to say my inner voice was, oh, they followed me. Like, there's no natural thing in the world. Why wouldn't they follow me?
Right.
And
Cosmos.
So yeah, it's like, yeah, of course. And so when I go in, I'm with the two other Marines. I said, oh, so you guys are in the fellowship too? Okay. All right, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? I didn't know that about you. I didn't know that you either. So, okay, so I had my little fellowship from the other, I think there were a total of 4 of us. And then Throneberry, the way he ran the platoon, I think I talked this about on another podcast. Someone got really interested in this. I told a few stories where Throneberry would intentionally deconstruct the world as we knew it with very intentional things.
Give me an example, please.
Well, 2 on different sides of the spectrum.
Sure.
To pull several narratives together, we had a few recruits that were bitten by snakes, and he cultivated a private snake catcher, a guy had a pathological fear of snakes, and in a primal, medieval, violent, vicious kind of a story, he became private snake catcher.
Okay.
Then he got private snake catcher to catch a snake. So he yells out to the platoon, he says, private snake charmer, report to the duty office. And if nobody reports, we do push-ups until somebody shows up. So I say, oh, this is enter stage, right? Yeah. So I run up, pound on the door. I said, sir, private snake charmer reporting his order, sir. He says, you can charm snakes? Yes, sir. He says, go get your snake charming gear. So I had it back in my footlocker, my prayer shawl that my parents had sent me. And I had a little Jewish prayer book. So I come back with my Jewish prayer book and my prayer shawl. And he says, okay, charm the snake. So I sat on the ground. I put my prayer shawl over my head. I began chanting the traditional Friday night service to the snake. The snake comes out of the coffee can and looks at me. And he goes like, okay, good job. Like, is this the most natural thing in the world?
Right, right.
And he says, okay, tell the snake to tell his snake friends to quit biting the Marines of platoon 3077. I said, snake? Go tell your snake friends that whatever. And he goes, okay, dismissed. And I thought it was as if this is the most natural, banal thing in the world. And this happened all the time. And so then your question is, well, what is real? Did I charm a snake? Did that snake know Hebrew? I don't know, but something just happened. And he seemed perfectly satisfied. So he had his 80 Marines that went down to 60 Marines.
Wow.
And he had his own private world that he created. And just a few of us, I think, understood what he was doing with incredible admiration. I thought to myself, who's writing his material? Right. Where's he getting this stuff from? This guy's brilliant. So
he knew how to play.
Man, did he know how to play. Yeah, that's a great word. I mean, we're playing in the deep deconstruction of reality and constructing another reality. I think it's because the Vietnam War no one was prepared for it. No matter how well we had trained, it was another reality. And he was a prisoner interrogator, so he was in the deep. And I think what he found was you got to let go of what you thought was real. And it's like Apocalypse Now. You ever seen the movie Apocalypse Now?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so as they're going down the river, remember Martin Sheen's look on his face when the Robert Duvall says, we're conquering the Ville so we can surf.
Yep.
That made complete sense to me.
Yep.
And the further they go down the river, the more unreal it is. That's actually one of my 2 favorite movies of all time.
Sure.
And so it was like that. It's as if he was taking us down the river. And I didn't see Apocalypse Now till when it came out in 79 or 80.
Right.
But you get the sense of it.
Yeah. And now the real question is, was Private Snake Charmer in your military army men?
Yeah, I actually got a medal. I got a copper star, in the Bible where it says the copper snake. No, it was,
Right.
yeah, all this was sub rosa. It was, it was all.
Ma, did you move Private Snake Charmer? Who moved? You're now brought into this new, I guess, more confirmed reality and your interface with reality. When does rabbinical school start? When does kind of that
So,
come to
I go to
life?
the Marines. I was in peacetime. I was actually a headquarters guy, and I met other people. I just, every now and then, some gunnery sergeant would walk up to me and say, yeah, I know who you are. And I read poetry and, I mean, pretty existential dark stuff, but there is a subculture in the Marine Corps that hardly anybody believes me was continuous throughout my service. Because I think other people join the Marines for the same reason.
Sure. It
Okay,
makes
so
sense. I mean, it makes perfectly logical sense that we're called to an action, right? Whatever that action is, we need to kind of fill this void. And like you're saying, like allow this to come through. And it would make sense that if you're going to build something up, you need to initially break it down, right? Consciously, subconsciously, you need to get to the belly of the beast. And what better way to break something down and build it up with the guides of law and order, discipline, and instilled discipline, a regimented discipline, because ultimately that's what, self-discovery boils down to some degree, is a level of discipline.
yeah, yeah. It was so deep because look, I wasn't in the infantry, but headquarters, it was pretty rigorous. And there were other guys. My best buddy introduced himself in this way. He was a black Muslim, like officially hated white people. And I'm on my rack and I'm reading The Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. He walks by and he says, "What's that shit kicking, clod hopping, white cracker ass hillbilly like you reading Solzhenitsyn?" I said, "Who you calling a shit kicking clod?" So we kind of confronted each other
That was it.
and we start talking. And he says, "Look, man, I can't be friends with you because you're white." I said, I'm Nation of Islam. I said, "That's sad." So he finds out that I'm Jewish. He says, as a Muslim, I'm a son of Ishmael. You're a son of Isaac. So like, we are actually brothers. I said, "Totally." So that was his excuse.
Right.
I wasn't
right.
white. I was a son of Isaac. He was a son of Ishmael. And that was
That's
his
okay.
way. Yeah, he was my best buddy in Okinawa. And when we came back, I was in Santa Ana and he was in Pendleton, and we still stayed in touch. And he was
It's just
a big part of it.
that's God recognizing God, right?
Totally, man. It was like when his name was T. Cooper, Teophus, T. Cooper, and it was wild because he's the guy that we would stay up all night talking about this stuff with.
Wow.
It was,
So
he
so
was my
so
spiritual
you're
buddy.
so your spirit, yeah, he's your journeyman, right? He's your
Yeah,
journeyman.
yeah.
So you're in the Marines, and then when does the idea of becoming a
Yeah, so
rabbi
I
and
get
pursuing
out
that
and I
from?
got to think, what do I want to do? So I thought, I love political science. I love philosophy. I thought, well, I'll major in political science, be a high school teacher or a philosophy teacher, college teacher, whatever. So I'm in again, this is a moment when I'm in my political science class in Long Beach City College, fall of 1976. I got out summer of 76. And we're studying comparative constitutions. And so I read the Soviet Constitution of 1936, where Stalin, if I remember correctly, no, how anybody hold me to this, where I read that Stalin outlawed the death penalty as he was murdering millions of people. So I raised my hand and I said, well, how do you count for the fact that murders against the law in the Soviet Constitution while he's murdering people? He said, we're studying systems of government, not the moral commitment to live up to ideals.
Wow. Yeah.
I raised my hand. I said, where do you study that? He goes, that's religion or something. I went, okay, so I think I'm going to study religion. I go home. I said, well, I'm Jewish. I want to study religion. So in my naivete, I thought, well, I guess that means I want to be a rabbi. Call the local rabbinical school in Los Angeles. I say, how to become a rabbi? I said, well, who are you? I said, I got out of the Marine Corps a few months ago. And I sounded very sketchy as a
How many rabbis are former Marines?
There you go. Yeah, so not many. So he says, look, get out of City College, go to Israel, learn Hebrew, go to USC. It's across the street. Let us get to know you. Yes, sir. I was a former Marine. I did exactly what he said. I called the travel agent.
Yeah, give me the directions and the rules to the game, and I'm going to play it accordingly.
I did exactly what he said. I finished the semester, went to Israel, learned Hebrew, applied to USC, came, and then I went to Jerusalem. I said, I'm that guy. He goes, wow, you did. I said, you told me to. What do you think I was going to do?
You told me what to do. Here I am. Let's go.
Yeah, he became a close mentor and friend. He was a beautiful man. Anyway, so I get to USC, I major in religion, the whole time thinking, I'm doing this to become a rabbi. And I took Hebrew classes at the Hebrew Union College, so I got to know the professors, and I kind of got the vibe of it. And I thought, yeah, it seems like a good fit. I mean, many rabbis who go through seminary say this. They don't really teach a spiritual path in mainline rabbinical schools.
Sure.
But they do teach how to read the text.
So now what's your relationship with religion? Because having this heightened sense of spirituality, are you taking things with a grain of salt going through school, or are you interfacing with them and taking kind of the mysticism behind them and the metaphors behind them and interpreting it through your own lens?
I would say both, meaning no grains of salt. I just completely compartmentalized. So I took Talmud and Midrash and this and that. There were no mysticism classes in those days. I studied on my own. I learned Aramaic, which made me able to study the Zohar. And I don't think I've ever talked about this. I was preparing for an exam in Midrash. So it's an ancient rabbinic set of texts. And I came across a unit that was so deep, and I wanted to understand it so badly. So I went into it, and I suddenly had the sense that the text was studying me.
Wow.
So I said, okay, this was a mystical experience. So I decided to tell my teacher, my Midrash professor. And he was like, wow, man, that's exactly how they studied it. He said, yeah, we're like teaching you how to study Midrash, but you experienced the Midrash.
Right.
We talked about it. He put on a symposium and he asked me to speak, second year rabbinical student.
Wow.
And it's somewhat, and a lot of other people spoke. I mean, I would say our conversation was the impetus. He went with it. And Vinny, I just became that guy, so when I gave my senior sermon on the Jacob and Esau story, Jacob, God appearing to him in the ladder and so forth. I thought that from an archetypal perspective. He says, he sees a ladder, Mutzav Arza, placed in the ground, Rosho Magia Hashamayma, the head reaching into the heavens. And I just said, we all exist at the bottom of that ladder. And, so that's what I did. I wasn't going to hide it. So every text.
So you brought it to the reality, and you brought it to your own particular, I don't want to say spin, but your own particular filter and guides, and kind
exactly.
of were able to funnel it and bring it to your language and speak your truth through it.
Exactly. It was very warmly received. I think people were glad to have me there. But remember, I already had an undergraduate degree in religion. So I read Paul Tillish's Dynamics of Faith. So I was well read in how to read religious texts, how to read metaphors, how to read poetry, especially that these texts indicate an ultimate reality that we can only apprehend through metaphor. So I knew all this. I had a degree in religion. So I brought my own spiritual sensibilities and my degree in religion into rabbinical school. And I have to say, it was very warmly received. They said, look, that's not what we teach, but great, And so I had conversations that my best buddy and I talked about it. So it was a very, it was not doctrinaire. It was like, we're going to teach you the text. We're going to teach you the history, the philosophy. You do what you want with it. I said, thank you. And I just was at play in the fields of the Lord, just digging it, loving it.
So it seems like in throughout, and I would say those are probably the big three chapters of your story, right? These big three introductions and these three moments that stand out to you in hindsight. It seems as though, they're bubbling up, but then there's still this mask that you have to kind of wear, right? You're wearing the mask in rabbinical school. It's like, that's great. You're interpreting it correctly, but we don't teach that. And in the Marines, it's kind of the same thing. Like, you're 1 in 10,000, cover that up. Yeah. And in high school, it's let's meet after school on Wednesdays. Mm-hmm. So there's all these different versions.
Well, I have to say, in rabbinical school, I took the mask off. Didn't matter anymore.
You did.
Yeah. And then I was having these deep existential questions regarding the study of Judaism. Where's the mystery? Because we're not being taught it. So I mentioned it to my campus rabbi, and she said, oh, the local region just hired a guy from Israel who studied with the major mystic of our time. His name was Adin Steinsaltzky in Israel. And his student was named Yonatan Omerman. And he said, they hired him to come, and he's looking for people like you. I said, great. We began studying.
They followed me again.
Yeah, and I just had the sense, of course he's here. Why wouldn't he be? So he and I studied for more than 10 years. He introduced me to Hasidic texts, to Kabbalah. I mean, he was my last real mentor. I thought this would go on my whole life until I realized I just graduated. Now I take on the mentees.
Wow.
Yonatan, we met every week. He was a hard teacher because he was in a school of Hasidic is Kabbalah, but with a very spiritual, psychological dimension. And there's a school of Hasidic thought, which is like Marine Corps boot camp, but for the soul. So the idea is strip away all inauthenticity. And it was spiritually brutal because he would tolerate no authenticity. So he was like my teacher Jack, but with an edge. And I showed up every week.
Now, did you show up as leaning into the spirituality element of things, or did you lean into more of the text element of things?
Well, you see, in Hasidic Judaism, there's no difference because there's a great a golden era of Hasidic Judaism, and one of the teachers was born in 1847, if I'm not mistaken, died in 1905. He died before he could put it together himself. So it's called The Language of Truth, Safat Emet. So this was one of, Yonatan had mastered many texts, but he said, let's study this one together. So 28 years old, he introduced me to Safat Emet, and it's like I took Yehuda Leib Alter, the author, as my Rebbe. And I made a decision, I'm studying him the rest of my life. Another part of me is I'm a chassid, I'm a devotee of Yehuda Leib Alter, who's a Ger Hasidic after a little town in Poland, who wrote this book, Sfat Emet, that I've been studying assiduously since I was 28 years old. So what is that, going on 40 years now? And Yonatan inducted me into it and gave me the skills to study many different Hasidic texts and the Zohar and many other things. And then our studies wrapped up after about 10 years. And I would say, Vinny, from that point on, I had an undergraduate degree in religion, I had rabbinical studies, I was good with the text, I knew Aramaic, I knew Kabbalah, I knew Hasidus, and I was launched, by, I would say, the mid-90s.
And now, when did you start to take this knowledge and all this experience and everything that you've gathered, all of the medicine that you've gathered, and when did you start to use that as a practice and start to kind of serve it to people?
Always. Every time I learned a text, every time I learned something, I integrated it. So, Hasidism is filled with spiritual practices that I teach. They're not easy to master, they're not easy to teach, but I'm upfront with it. If you want to do the real thing, here's what you got to do. So I had been integrated. Look, I also had a doctorate in religion. So I understand the phenomenon very well, and I understand the nature of text, metaphor, consciousness, the nature of language mediating between the unconscious and the conscious. I had studied Jung, Hill. It's a long life of incessant reading, and I began to put something together. I began teaching it. The response was great. I would say the main thing that's happened to me since is then I began to counsel people, and I realized they had great insight. They'd been to therapy. In boot camp, you didn't need insight. You need to follow directions. So I would say, well, don't say those kinds of things to your spouse. But, I feel this, I feel that. I thought to myself, did it ever occur to me in boot camp to say, well, I feel this, sir, so I'm going to say it? At some level, yeah, your feelings matter, but they don't matter when you're doing your duty. So why did the Marines hold the ground at Alligator Creek, August 22nd, 1942? They didn't ask what they felt.
Right.
They felt fear.
I'm sure a lot of them felt right. I'm sure a lot
they
of them
felt fear, but Marines don't retreat. Never occurred to them. So I had the sense of duty. So look, your duty is not to raise your voice. Your duty is to speak rationally and not to succumb to every provocation. Well, I felt this. I said, wow, there's some bad medicine out there. So I educated myself in rational emotive behavioral therapy, William Glasser, cognitive. As much as I was versed in the Jungian world, I also gained expertise in the world of virtue, wisdom, managing consciousness. And that's what really, in a way, launched me, as a very good counselor. I mean, people have to show I've changed their lives by helping them deal with anger, depression, shame, guilt, and so forth, because there's a way that the higher self can manage the unconscious ego self. It's deep, but there is a method. There is a way to do it. Jiu-jitsu helped a lot, by the way.
Oh, we're gonna get into jiu-jitsu. Don't worry about that.
There's a method. Anyway, so early 2000s, I start to put this system together. It just developed every year, and then I began to teach it a lot. Stephen Pressfield and I became friends because we're teaching something in similar fashions, and I've put together a system. I'm on my fourth rewrite of the book I'm trying to get out on this. I'm liking it more and more, and hopefully it'll get out. But in the meantime, ever since Stephen Pressfield told Rich Roll to have me on his podcast, my website's blown up before we were ready.
Yeah, well, that's a good thing, right?
I want to take the challenge, and I call it virtue, rationality, wisdom, and depth. And I'm going to take the challenge, and as much as I am able, for people who respond to this path, I want to articulate it, teach it, and help people get through their lives with the least amount of avoidable suffering and the most amount of honor and integrity that I can.
That's beautiful. A line of demarcation in my life, and if we had to label it, when I would say I became a man, right? If someone came up to you and said, when did you become a man, right? And I'm sure people have a variety of different answers to that question. And for me, it's when I was able to respond to life rather than react to life.
Absolutely.
And there is, I talk about it a lot, and it's almost a superpower where it's almost as if time stops and stands stills, and you could matrix around what is coming up in you. And then to me, it's your responsibility to interface with that, reverse engineer it, get to the depth and the root of that, and now give a response with, calm and breath and other tactics that you could use, but to respond to a trigger or whatever we want to use rather than just react. But yet it's our instinct, right? It's in our DNA, right, to react. It's in our, the subconscious mind to react. How do people?
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate. That's beautifully articulated. It's exactly what my life is about. So you and I are echoing into each other, and I wish people would just hear what you just said and memorize it, because it is worth memorizing.
Thank you. I don't take compliments well, but I'm working on it.
Okay.
So obviously in your practice and in your counseling work, there is that first initial wave of reaction, because that's kind of both what we're taught. It's what comes instinctually to us. How do you guide people through that reaction and allow them and invoke out of them? How do you get past the reactionary stage of life?
The reactive, yeah. So when people come in who ask me, I said, look, let me tell you what's up. I'm training you virtue, rationality, wisdom, and depth. And it's like jujitsu. You're a white belt. So there are things you do and don't do. And I start there and say, well, I felt this. You need more backstory. I said, when someone comes to the club, we don't need to know how they feel. We don't need to know the backstory. You have to learn how to move your hips. When someone's on top of you, you don't push and invite an arm lock. Right? So they say, well, you need to all this. I said, okay, I really care about you, but I don't need to know, because I see the mistake you're making. You think that when you get provoked, you get to raise your voice and tell somebody off. How's that going for you? Not well. So let's do it my way. And that's the resistance, Vinny. People are so used to the idea that their feelings are the most important thing, which they are until your feelings go bad. And when your feelings go bad, rationality and virtue are the most important thing. Till things calm down, then go back to the good feelings. So the idea that there is a path called virtue, rationality, and then wisdom and depth. The people who counsel with me, I try to be gentle. Jiu-jitsu is the gentle sport, right? The gentle art.
Yep.
But I'm insistent. People can start to, well, what about this? What about this? I'll say, look, okay, I'll answer all your questions, but eventually we're going to have to get back to, when you feel pressure, don't push, move your hips. You can say, this isn't working for me. You can say, let me think about that. See, those are basic white belt moves. By the way, I have people who heard me say this on the other podcast, Rituals podcast, who wrote me emails and say, that changed my life, that I have the permission to say, this is not working for me right now, because they didn't want to break bad into unvirtuous behavior. So that's what it looks like from a counseling perspective. So then a person has relative mastery of virtue. So now let's really master rationality. Now let's go down to wisdom. So I have a program, white, blue, purple.
Right. And now how are people receptive to that? What percentage of people say, okay, like, all right, I'll succumb to your guides and your teachings?
Yeah, well, I'll defer to you.
Right.
Yeah. So I would say 100%.
I'll tap to you.
Yeah, except that, as you and I both know, that's not what happens on the mat.
Of course not.
What happens on the mat is you're teaching someone, and the white belt says, well, what do we do if they do that? That's not today's move.
Right.
And you say, stay focused on today's move. But what about if? I said, we'll get there. So that even just learning how to attend the class is a jujitsu skill, right?
Yeah.
Just being on the mat. Now, I'm not trying to win anything. What I'm trying to do is help you learn jujitsu. And by keep asking, what do I do if? You're not going to learn today's move. Now, you stay for a year, you'll know about all the what ifs. But today, let's learn today's move. So I teach like that. So what's my success rate? 100%, because anybody who doesn't want to stay on the mat leaves. So everybody's on the mat's on the mat.
Yeah, that's one thing with jiu-jitsu, that it definitely, it separates people, right? And I've told this story a couple of times, but I remember early white belt, and I was rolling with another white belt, and it was, it was time to, pass guard and live rolling. And I remember him tying his belt, and he literally, and I can't remember the exact phrase, and I wish I did, but it was like an action move. He's like, "It's go time," right?
Yeah.
And he didn't tap me, I didn't tap him. It was, it was two white belts rolling.
Right.
And he never showed up again. His ego, you want to say big ego, small ego, whatever version of his ego, couldn't get past his 80s action movie line that didn't end with a roundhouse kick to the face.
Yeah.
So it does separate. And I feel like jiu-jitsu specifically, because it's so diverse. You have people who are in it for the sport element of jiu-jitsu, right? And then you have people who are in it for the work. I think everyone's in it for the workout, right? But then there's the other side, the other people on the mat that are into the philosophy and the psychology and the chess moves and the setups for the setups that are 10 times over. And that's kind of where I reside. I do enjoy the competition aspect, but I really am more on the, hey, let's talk about philosophy.
I didn't know anything about that. All I knew was Hoist Gracie defeated Don Fry. That's all I need to know.
That's it.
Hoist Gracie defeated, because I did Shotokan karate for 20 years. Hoist Gracie defeated the Japanese national champion. I said, okay,
right.
What is this?
What is this?
So now when I began training, then I began to see what it was. And what I call honoring the sport. So sometimes when I'm working with a white belt and they were working so hard for me not to pass their guard. And I don't want to push it, but I say, you need to hear me. I said, "You're strong. I'd have to up my game to pass your guard, and you're just like a 2-month white belt, but you're not learning jiu-jitsu." So what do? I said, "Watch a black belt pass your guard and learn. It's not about you stopping me from passing your guard, because ultimately I can do it if I put enough effort into it. But you're not going to learn anything, because when it gets to that level and I pass your guard, you're going to panic. What you could do is roll 50% and watch how I do it. Well, then you're just going to pass my guard." I said, "And then what's going to happen?" What's the worst thing that'll happen? A black belt passed a white belt's guard. What's the worst thing that will happen next?
Right.
They go, nothing.
Side control.
Yeah, like you're learning jiu-jitsu. Don't you want to watch a black belt do it? And it's just to watch that, the expression on the face change. Oh, so I'm not here to win. I'm here to honor the sport.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
There is that learning element, and what I'm always impressed by when training with a black belt and my professor is the ability to dial in on the different frequencies at different times, and I'll call him out like, "Oh, at this point you were a high level blue, and then you dialed back to, then you dialed up to a brown, and then you kind of," he's like, "Oh, that part I was black belt." I was like, "All right, I feel good. If I made you go to the black belt toolbox, I can feel pretty good about that training session."
Yeah.
How did you?
At our club, the black belts have a philosophy, which is if they earn it, they get it. So if I feel that a white belt is doing it right, they pass my guard. They tap me out because they did it right. And I want to reward them for doing it right. So in many ways, black belt consciousness is we're here to honor the sport. I mean, I say, our club owner, Chris Liscandro, who, awarded me my purple, brown, and black, and my main training buddy, Vince Martinez. I mean, there's a beauty and gentleness of their souls that, like, I'm an older guy, I'm 66, I had a heart attack, I have 2 bad shoulders, I had a spinal injury. I feel so safe that it's never going to get to the point where I'm going to reduce my longevity. So there's something in this sport where we honor each other, we honor the sport. Now there are competitors, so they go compete somewhere else, or they might agree to roll at a competitive level.
Right.
But I really am there to honor the sport, as I think is everybody else after a while.
Yeah, it for me again, it resides in the psychological, philosophical space more so than the sport. And then obviously the workout that you do get from it there's nothing like it. I was doing CrossFit pretty consistently, and I put on a gi and started warming up around the mat, I was like, oh, this is a different kind of being in shape now. Like I have to, like I have to change what I perceive as being in shape. Like this has to change now. Like it's not
Exactly right.
And
Yeah,
it,
I used to do karate and I used to jog and lift weights. Nothing prepared me for BJJ.
yeah, and then it becomes an energetic thing where you want to like fuel yourself the right way. You want to eat right. You want to think right, and then you want to have that clarity so that when you are in those positions, you are in an optimized state of awareness, and physically you want to be optimized.
Correct, exactly. So people say, does it get me in shape? I say, I stay in shape so I can go.
Exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So it's one thing Chris has in the club is a set of pictures going from Carlos Sr. and Helio, to Carlos Jr., to Higan Machado, to Hanato Magno, to Chris, and then all his black belts. And I walk in and I look at that. It's like a religious feeling. There's been a tradition passed down for 100 years now.
Right.
It's 100 years. And I'm going to master this thing. I have relative mastery, and I'm going to, as much as I can, when I can, I'm going to impart it to a new generation. So when I'm gone, there's going to be guys that will say, "Yeah, Finley taught me that move," and because I honored the sport. Now they're going to teach it, and they're going to pass on, and they're going to transmit it. So I think one thing as a religious person embedded in a tradition, I understand the profundity of what it means to learn a tradition, master a tradition, and impart a tradition, because the tradition is more important than the individual person.
Yeah, it's that old expression, the man who plants a tree and knows he'll never sit underneath it understands, right?
Yeah.
What's your relationship with things like quantum physics? Let's get deep now. What is your relationship? Like you talk about depth as being a key core component of your teachings. How deep do things go? Because again, for some people, I'll speak to people and they'll say, well, not everything's that deep, And to me, I say it is. It's just a matter of if you want to stop at a certain depth.
Vinny, it's eerie you should ask me this. You and I, we're brothers in some universe, because I'm just now reading a book by Houston Smith called Why Religion Matters. The chapter I'm on now is I'm studying yet again the layperson's understanding of quantum physics.
I have to ask, is this real? Right, exactly.
Yeah, is this level of reality real, or is that level of reality real?
From your different, obviously interpretations of reality and the depth of reality, what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts of how deep things go?
Well, infinitely deep, but the main thing that quantum physics has answered for me is when people, there's a school of thought that says we're just brains, we're just matter, therefore there is no morality, therefore there's no free will. So you've heard there are famous people who believe that.
Sure.
And so when you study quantum physics, in the randomness in the interior of the atom, many spiritually oriented physicists say there's a will being expressed. People have said, you look into the depth of the atom, metaphorically, you see the mind of God. Now, half the physicists think this is silliness, and the other half think this is real. So I'm going to go with the side that says, when we discover the interior of the atom, then we understand the nature of consciousness. Therefore, we understand the nature of choice and decisions. Therefore, we understand that morality is real. So I've always believed that we live in a moral spiritual framework. But my lay person's continuous going into this this brilliant spring waters of quantum physics every now and then, it just gives me a theory of reality in which my thoughts exist. So how deep does it go? We're limited by our senses. We're living, according to Immanuel Kant, we're limited by our categories of experience. Kant says you can't know things on sich, in their interiority. We can only know things phenomenologically, as they appear to consciousness as a phenomenon. On the other hand, something in our consciousness can, in a non-reasoned way, transcend phenomenological experience and maybe not know the inner depths of something in a sensory way or a cognitive way, but in a spiritual way, experience the depths of ultimate reality. So how far can we go? It's inexhaustible. There's no limit to how far we can go. It's how much time and discipline you're going to put into it.
I'm a huge advocate of sensory deprivation. I've been doing it for quite some time now. And the creator of the sensory deprivation thing, John C. Lilly, talks about what he refers to as the 0 point, which is a point of consciousness. And now they're studying it and they're calling it the Lilly wave, because it's kind of this. It's not quite an alpha or theta or delta state of brain waves. It's its own kind of unique wave of consciousness. And he speaks about it. And I've personally have had, or what I perceive to be, have reached the 0 point, right? The absolute 0 point of consciousness. It was, I couldn't put it to words, but if I had to, it was the yin and the yang. It was emptiness and abundance. And it felt like I was flying through outer space.
Yeah.
And the moment I recognized this experience, I instantly snapped right out of it. And he goes on to say that that experience is actually just the beginning. And there's another, because you can still interface with that experience, it's still a layer that you can go past. And the depth of that now. So then I question it and I sit and go, well, what is the next layer? Is the next layer potentially death? Is that what the next layer of consciousness is? Or is there just the level of never coming out, and I say never, but not coming out of that state once you recognize it, but now just almost, letting go into it?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the gifts of my teacher, Jack Bishop, when I was in 11th grade, was he took me there. Without getting into a sensory deprivation tank, he led me and walked me back and led me.
Wow.
So that was one of the things he did. Secondly, I studied Kabbalah, and in the, there's a 10 emanation diagram of Kabbalah. The upper 3 are the mystical levels. So what you described, I actually wrote it in an article for a journal on the mystical experience of the divine name. Now the divine name is in English letters YHVH, which is the Hebrew word for the cause of being, which you'll never see in a translation, although that's what God's name means. And there's a Kabbalistic Hasidic practice of rising into the interior of the beingness of God, which reads exactly on what you just described. And it's been mapped out by mystics. So it's a known thing with mystics, and there is a map.
I'm reading the Who Will Cry When You Die by Robin Sharma, and he talks about, and I can't remember the exact pulling of this story, but it's the God basically creates gods, and he hides that they're gods, and they're all suggesting to him, hide it at the deepest sea, and he says, no, someone will swim the depths. Hide it on the highest mountains, someone will climb the mountains. And he finally comes to the idea of, I'm going to hide it, that God is God, that you are God in the depth of your heart. Mm-hmm. And that's where man will go to, but he'll never go as deep as he potentially can go.
That's a nice narrative, but as I listen to it, it's not a story I would tell, but I get it. It's okay.
Right.
I'm in another tradition. I'm in the more Kabbalistic tradition of divine emanation, both the unveiling of the divine, and on the Gnostic side, the tragedy of the birth of evil. So I live in a different conceptual world, but remember, it's language, it's metaphors.
Sure.
It's narratives, it's symbols, and we just not ought take them too seriously because they're indicating depths of the self that are pre-linguistic. They're pointing to realities that are metalinguistic. And here we are stuck in the middle, and we're negotiating this terrain. So yeah, I get the story. I would tell the story differently, but I understand what the story is trying to tell us.
How would you tell a story, if you don't mind me asking? Put you on the spot.
It would really depend on the question, because when people ask the question, I know the story they need. Okay. Here's one of my favorite. Now, this is not politically correct to tell the story today, but here's how I heard it. So this is like the Navajos, but you can say the Apaches or whatever tribe. Someone said
sure.
The Navajo. So the kid says to the grandfather, where does snow come from? And the grandfather says, well, here's how it happened. The gods were playing with some kind of toy, some kind of, like ball or something up in the heavens. And it rolled down to earth. And a little boy like you found it and wouldn't give it back. And the gods were saying, please give it back, please give it back, please give it back. So the kid says, okay. So he tosses it back up to the heavens. And as a gesture of gratitude, the gods say, whenever we sweep out our fire, we'll sweep the ashes into earth, and that's snow. And the kid said, yeah, but ashes are hot and snow is cold. And the grandfather says, you are so far from being a Navajo. So I heard
Right.
this story probably when I was a kid, and it just spoke to me. I said, it's symbols. It's to take our. So sometimes when a person says, but I don't understand how this could be this and this could be that, I said, you're a long way from being a Navajo, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So you say, what story will I tell? Well, what's your question?
Right.
You know, and when when I hear the right question, for a given level of consciousness, I'll tell the story to match that level of consciousness. Because one thing I've discovered, and you know this intuitively, you can't give a teaching beyond a person's capacity to grasp it, even if you're taking them to the next level. And this is what Jack Bishop did with me so carefully was he would give me a teaching that would expand my consciousness, but not a teaching that was beyond my capacity for expansion.
Sure.
And he did this every week, every week, every week. So I understand what it means for consciousness to be slowly and consistently expanded. So that's my pedagogy as a teacher is I answer the question to take the person up to the next level.
That's beautiful. Yeah. It's meeting people where they are,
Correct.
uh,
And
and
taking
and
them one step further.
just one small step, and that's really like micro and again, the mind body spirit element of things and how they all interface and interact with each other. One starts to feed the other, and you start to elevate and become optimized in all these different arenas. And they're very, I mean, very tough waters to navigate, and for so many people, the like we spoke about a little bit earlier, that awareness comes to the table and it's brush it off, that's a coincidence, or that's X, Y, and Z. And then eventually I think it comes around to being whether it be a health issue, or as we spoke a little bit earlier, something traumatic happens that kind of forces you or propels you into the next level of that. And then it becomes accountability, awareness, discipline. And then, as you were saying, the depth element of things, and how deep and how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go?
Yeah. And so the way I would put it is I don't know why things happen. People say it's a miracle, it's random, it's all planned out. I don't know. That's way beyond my pay grade.
Right.
I just know, like, well, what is happening? Let's not try to figure out the cosmic plan, because that's actually not something I need to know. I need to know how to respond to my inner growth and what's happening with me, what's happening to other people. I try to keep my questions very pragmatic.
Mm.
So, and then I notice as I work on myself, then it feels as if a teaching has sought me. I'll give you an example. So here I am in high school doing all this deep inner work. I'm down at the Long Beach Jewish Community Center, poke around the library, and I see a book on Hasidism, which I, of course, learned more fully much later. I said, I heard of this. What is this? I open the book to the middle, and I read a phrase, and Menachem Mendel of Vorky, when he says a Jew, he means like kind of the ideal religious human being. He says, what constitutes a true Jew? I couldn't wait. He says,
I couldn't wait.
yeah, he says, silent screaming, upright kneeling, silent screaming, and motionless dance.
Wow.
It took my breath away.
Wow. Yeah.
17 years old, standing in the library of the Long Jewish Community Center. I pull a book out at random. I open it to a page, and it just broke my heart. And I said, I have to know this. And so I read the book a little bit. Life goes on, and then I meet my Hasidic teacher, Jonathan Omerman, who says, "Oh yeah, well, that's what we're going to study for the next 10 years." So, I can say, yeah, in retrospect, it looks like miracles. In front of me, it looks random, and I'm not going to try to figure that out. I'm just going to try to develop myself as much as I can, guide people as much as I can, meet them where they are, take them to the next level. I love jujitsu. Cultivate the spirit, cultivate my mind. I'm not really saying I have to be balanced. I'm just, it's not, I never said I have to be balanced. It just worked out that way.
Yeah.
If that's possible.
Yeah, and do you have any practices? I'm sure you have a ton, but are there any practices that you do on a daily basis that kind of keep you in that mindset? Like, is there any journaling or meditation that
No,
keep you present?
This is a Hasidic practice. You learn deeply how to read a verse of the Bible. So I remember someone said, yeah, I read the book of Psalms. I said, Okay, I'm sorry, that's not working for me because you read a verse a day, you memorize it, and you go to the interior. So the founder of the Hasidic movement said, every word of the Bible and the prayer book has infinite depths. There's infinite worlds, angels, and souls underneath every word. So I have my well-worn Bible. I'll pick a verse that I've already underlined. I'll find another one. I'll read it, memorize it, look at each word, and go in and meet the worlds and angels and souls embedded in the world. I come out, go to the next word. It might be 6 words in the verse. I put them all together. I try to hold this a meaning that cannot be articulated. I try to memorize it, and that takes me to a deep place. So one of my practices is what's called the study of holy words. It's a Hasidic practice, and it's very much rooted in the study of the Psalms and Proverbs and the Hebrew prayer book. So that's one practice, and it's a practice that I teach people who say, how do I get going? Now that's one thing, and there are I have 18 different practices that I teach.
Right.
And that's one that I do most days, in addition to several others. You asked for one, I gave you one.
Yeah, and now those practices, they obviously bring out a feeling, right? Essentially, it boils down to feeling, right? Because there's even
not. I would say it includes feeling.
Oh, well put. Yes, it includes a feeling.
Yeah.
So how much of that feeling do we use, or should someone use, or can someone use, or do you use in your interface with this reality and interface in this world, right? Because that feeling, I think, essentially is the God self coming through, right? And now that is to use as a reference point for other feelings and interface with what's transpiring in front of you based off of the feeling that it's bringing out.
Well put. So let's say, now this is my path. It begins conceptually. So I believe that language mediates between the unconscious and the and consciousness and metaphysical reality. And our brains naturally work with concepts, which in a way try to delimit reality into comprehensible units. So for example, the phrase, the light of God is the human soul. Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam. So let's take the word ner, light. So we talked about quantum physics, the nature of light. So I meditate on the concept of light. I might have the image of a candle come to mind, hold that in consciousness. This is the light of Yud He Vav He, the cause of being. We'll skip over that for now, is the Nishmat Adam, the human soul. Okay, so I go down into the human soul, the human, Adam, the soul. Okay, and so I try to experience all that on a deep level until it becomes, the meaning assembles itself in my soul in a pre-linguistic way. It delivers a version of it back into my consciousness. This verse, which I've been studying my entire adult life, gets rebirthed within me. And I look at you, right? The light of God is the human soul. You're sharing your light with me.
Wow.
And so you walk around and everybody has a soul. And everybody has light. And like, can I do anything that will help that light come out without being weird about it?
Or even being weird about it. Like,
sometimes.
Let's be weird about it.
Yeah, so I embarrass my wife and kids because I'll see somebody in the store and, I'll wear like a Marine Corps hat or a jiu-jitsu sweatshirt and they come up to me and I realize, okay, so that's a bid for something deeper. I can feel, are we, like shooting the breeze or getting somewhere. And suddenly, man, I had the other day I had the most real moment in Costco because a guy saw my jiu-jitsu jacket and we start talking about the flow.
Yep.
We start talking about the sport coming through. I mean, we got into the deepest conversation. He goes, man, I know I talk too much. I said, you are talking the perfect amount. Like we had this like deep thing. And I agreed to meet my wife over in like Iowa, whatever. And so she said, where you been? I said, I just got into the deepest conversation. She goes, again?
Right.
So I go find the guy, he's a big guy. I bring him, I said, there's a new best friend, James,
Right.
Like,
yeah, eating free samples, right? Eating free samples in Costco.
You gotta be open to and ready for it. And if it's in Costco, it's in Costco. You step to the side, and people are walking by, and like they look at this medium-sized old white guy with this huge black guy having an intimate moment. Clearly, like we're like off the chain somewhere.
Yeah.
And then we kind of float back to reality, and we say, "What are we
Yes.
going to do now? We're going to do now. We're going to remember this moment forever. That's what we're going to do."
Yeah, I'm gonna go get seltzer, but not really. Like that's just what my body's doing.
Yeah.
You mentioned flow, and one thing I think one of the most important things is discovering flow. I think it's so paramount for people. I think, and that's kind of what we spoke about a little bit earlier about, like playing, right? Like that's one thing that I get from my children is, you know, this new or revisited interaction with reality and interaction with play. And you know, I think so many people get away from, we have busy lives, there's no question about that, but get away from flow. And flow, it really is a gateway and a pathway and almost a super highway really to the soul. It's a gateway and super highway to the highest version of yourself. And when you could find things that, you know, present flow to you and put you in that flow state, you know, there's nothing else going on in the world like you in Costco.
Mhm. Yeah. And rituals are flow. You know, a ritual is a poem
Sure.
acted out. You enter, so the Jewish tradition is filled with these flow rituals where you just hand your consciousness over to the ritual. Now you have to study it. You have to understand it as a poem and then turn yourself over to it. There, you know, humor, I think, is a big part of flow. I think relationships in some way are built on the way that we can evoke play in each other. Because that's one of the I think, one thing that intimacy can allow is we can be playful with each other, playful in the sense of having fun with each other, which then opens us up onto a new kind of mystery, which is we can play act with each other. Because, you know, all jokes and teasing and playfulness, we assume a different person for a moment. Usually I'm the object of the teasing and they get to be the tormentor for a moment, but it's love. You know, so my kids got this line from a movie somewhere. I would say to one of my daughters, "I love you so much." And they would say, "It would be so cute, Daddy, if I loved you too."
Right, right.
So, yeah. So what's being communicated there? Irony, wit,
Right.
timing, love, depth, all in that little silly interchange. So there's the flow in the mat, there's flow in rituals, there's flow in merging with the ocean. So this word flow is, you know, where you turn consciousness over to the sense of play in all of its different meanings. And it's
Yeah. I think
core
flow
to
is,
everything.
yeah, I think flow, and there's the flow of the universe, right? The ebb and the flow, the yin and the yang, and the balance to that. And you know, it's also about not going against that, right? Not being the white belt that stiff arms and puts himself in an arm
Uh,
bar,
okay,
right?
so here's where you and I might differ, because that is very much, you know, some forms of Stoicism, find the flow, get in the flow, some forms of Greek philosophy. So I sometimes feel the flow's going the wrong way. And I'm here to re-irrigate this field. I'm not letting the flow go that way. And so I might adjust the flow. I say, you know, we're not going here. I'm not going with this flow. This flow is not taking us to a beautiful place. Well, who put you in charge? I just put myself in charge, right? Somebody had to take control of the situation. So yeah, I get the idea of flow, but also what a conscious, courageous person has to do is say, this flow is not going to a good place. I'm going to shift the flow. So I believe in intervening in the flow. I know I might be an outlier in the spiritual community. It's something I don't believe in going with the flow. I believe in, you know, we say semper fidelis in the Marine Corps, being faithful to a higher order. And if the flow is not flowing according to that higher order, then I might be the guy that has to shift it.
Is there a potential that if the flow is not going in a direction which you sees to be the flow, could it be that that is still the flow? Although you're
Yeah.
just you're obviously, you know, it's like maybe just coming up against rocks in the river. The river's still the flow, but
Yeah.
you're just coming up against rocks and it's not the actual flow of it.
That's beautifully put. So if I were committed to the idea of flow, I'd say yes. But since I'm not committed to the idea of flow, I'm in the metaphor of conscious irrigation. Like we're going to put this water where it's most needed and not let it run down the mountainside and destroy everything in its path. Yeah, so the water will naturally flow down the mountain and ruin everything. Or you can channel it so it makes everything beautiful into a garden. So you know why Vinny, as I'm thinking about this, I'm talking to you. I see emotions flow out of people. And they say, well, it's natural, it's just my flow. I say, yeah, it's like a torrent coming down a hillside and destroying everything in its path. So what we're going to do is we're going to rechannel this energy.
But isn't there a potential that that's actually not the flow? Like, so it's to your point, I guess. And what I'm saying is that you're absolutely right that maybe that's not the authentic flow that they're interfacing with. And maybe that's just a traumatized flow or a past transgression flow or pent up anger flow. And they're perceiving it as a flow and fluidity, but in reality, it's actually not the flow at all. And it's going against the flow.
Yeah. Okay, so here's what I'm noticing. You're very committed to the idea of flow, and I honor you for it. And you're
Okay,
making it
thank
work.
you. All right.
It's just not my term. So here's what I just have to delineate. You and I are talking about the same thing with different metaphors.
Beautiful.
I prefer the idea of irrigation.
Sure.
Let's channel this stream. Somebody else says, "Oh no, but flow works for everything." I said, "Great, let's just have different metaphors."
Beautiful. I could roll with that.
We're rolling. We're flowing.
I could roll with just agreeing to disagree.
Yeah,
right?
on a metaphor.
Right.
There's no
Right.
substantial disagreement. We just use different metaphors, which is beautiful.
But and that's kind of one of the crazier things that we're seeing now with the climate of our culture and in society, and we kind of spoke a little bit about, is that the flow, people can't just agree to disagree on the metaphor of the flow, right? Like it's okay. Like, all right, so irrigation or the flow and hitting rocks, does it really matter? I think we're communicating this and we're saying the same thing.
As long as we're committed to the world of value. Now, here's something that's true. You and I could share values, but we believe they are actualized in different ways. The main thing is, what values do we share? You explain to me how your policies and decisions honor those values. I'll listen. Then you listen to me, and we learn from each other. So this is my ideal model of civility, respect, understanding the soul of another human being, listening, communicative discourse, and then, and as if we're setting up a bank reserve for the future, so when we can talk again and no one's going to get their eyebrows singed here. Sure. And that's the tragedy that I see, is that people have such a stake that people have to think exactly like them or they're bad. And I would say, look, I could be wrong, but I won't respond well to being insulted.
Sure.
I'd rather you reason me out of my position than try to bully me out of my position. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying there's a way to persuade people, and bullying and defaming and insulting isn't typically one of them.
Right. People are not going to respond, or we're just going to go into a reaction state when given that circumstance, right? Because now it's a right or wrong, and
people dig in and become defiant. That's exactly right.
Right. And there's not this idea of like, and it's to that idea of, I can be wrong. Like there's a very strong and that's where the depth thing for me comes in. It's like, and we joked about it a little bit with is this real? If you can question it, it's at least worth questioning and allow it to sit on the shelf as that. And it doesn't mean you need to believe it or you need to lean into 1,000% and stand your ground, but it's worth questioning. And if it's worth questioning, then it should be questioned and it's allowed to be questioned.
Exactly. And to put a fine point on it, this little vaccinated people say, "Are you vaccinated?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "Well, it's a plot and it's Bill Gates." And I said, "You know what? It's 50% plus one yes. So you don't get 51% vaccinated. You get the whole regime." However, I'm not saying I'm not listening to you.
Right.
I'm not saying you have to put some doubt in my mind. It was 50% plus one. So let me hear your whole thing. And I just want to hear what you think. And if you want to, I'll tell you what I think. But let's just calm down and share our worlds with each other.
Right. What a beautiful way to put it.
So in every debate that I've had, I say, there are people who can say, let's calm down. You share with me your values, the facts as you understand them, the policies you recommend. Let's be civil and respectful. And I'll say, great. And now it's going to be my turn. It's going to be your turn. And we're going to walk away, shake hands, embrace each other. And I say to myself, I was edified by that. I was edified by the substance, by the style, by their reasoning, by their mastery. And I might change my mind. So there's a beautiful way that people who think differently can engage and each one walk away edified.
Do you think most people really understand their values, or do you think that they're all kind of pre-programmed based off of whether it be family or culture or society? Do you think people have a real relationship with their values, or are their values embedded in something else?
Yeah, I would say most people don't reflect on their values, meaning they know, for example, the value of a college education. Right? That's a clear, let's say, I call a non-moral value.
Sure.
And then I say to a family, is your kid ready for college? is this your kid going to get what they need from college? Could those 4 years be better spent somewhere else? Someone said, no, 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 they have to go to college. I said, okay. But see, I would rather step up and say, what's in the best interest of the child? What's their soul journey? What do these 4 years mean? Like, I'm really happy the Beatles didn't go to college.
Right.
Can you imagine?
Right.
Composition, introduction to anthropology, or write some of the best music in the history of humanity between 22, right?
Right.
So I don't know, but I'll hear your point. Would you like to hear mine? No, I don't want to hear your point because it conflicts with my values. I said, okay, I'm not pushy. But what I would prefer is a person says, I said, do you have the best interest of your child in mind? Yes. What does that mean? College education. Would you like to hear my point of view? Yeah, okay. So I make my case and they go, oh, that's a really good point of view. What should I do? I said, get to know this. I call it parenting the soul of the child. Try to understand where your child is in their journey and see, is it a 4-year path? Are they going to go a little bit slower? 6 year? Are they going to take a couple of years? Like I took off 4 years between high school and college. None of my kids went straight to college. They all turned out pretty well. So this is just a banal example of, yeah, I have a value, and somebody say, and I will not reflect on it. It's solid, it's rigid. I will not veer right or left. And other people say, I'm willing to have an overarching value, the well-being of my child, and I'm now willing to examine how to actualize that. So I believe a person can say, here are my values. And by the way, values are going to conflict. You know, there's security versus liberty.
Sure.
Right? All values conflict with each other. And then we're going to see how they translate into policies. And then we learn by discussing with each other. So I would say most people do not reflect on their values because their values are set by their family, their religion, political party, whatever. And it's the ideal person in Finley's mind. This might not be the ideal person. It's just, what I think.
Sure.
I value reflecting on your values and being willing to enter into rational conversation of people who probably share the same values with different hierarchy. And let's compare our mythologies. I think that's a book by Leonard Cohen.
Yeah.
Let us compare mythologies.
Yeah, it's a reverse engineering process, and I think you bring up parenting, and that's something that I definitely lean into, and will say it's one of my favorite things to do is be a father. I genuinely love being a father. My daughter's 6, my son is 2, and I read this. A buddy of mine showed me this poem. I will not know the author of the poem, but the overall meaning is that your children are not yours. You are the archer and they are the arrow, and you are meant to just send them on their journey. But to your point, especially when it comes to education and it comes to schools and you want to instill your values in your children, but I think the essence of the value is what we should be instilling, right? Whatever you may get out of college or you may get out of this political affiliation or whatever it is, try to get to the root and the essence, the feeling around it, and now bring that to your child and then allow them to make well-informed decisions based off of feelings and the essence of it.
Yes, I have a quip that I say, less advice, more wisdom. You want to teach your kids something? Don't teach them to agree with you. Teach them wisdom. And there are very few people more suited to teach a child true wisdom than a parent. Because wisdom is modeled. Wisdom is reinforced all the time. It's reinforced in family dinners, in jokes and walks and hikes that, a family, you might say, manifests certain kinds of wisdom. Sometimes when I work with families, I recommend that they create a coat of arms, with the 4 values in each corner. Mm-hmm. So everybody can understand, there's usually more than the 4 values of our family, and let everybody come up with their own coat of arms and then show each other and say, wow, that's our family and that's how you think it? Yeah. And that's how you see it. And here's how I see it. Wow. Let us compare coats of arms. So, one thing we can teach is our children, I call it parenting the soul of the child, which means evoking their consciousness of their own soul, insight to themselves, insight to others, what the wisdom path is, and then slowly get out of their way.
Be the alchemist.
Yeah, it's a kind of an alchemy, except it's much less present than an alchemist. I'm teaching alchemy. I'm not being the alchemist.
Right.
I'm teaching them the skills of inner alchemy, and then I'm going to slowly just become the person that they call me when they need me.
Right. Well, right. You're teaching by doing. right? And by being your own alchemist and showing up as your own personal alchemist, you can now teach them
Yeah.
to be their own alchemist and go
Yeah.
on their journey and of self-discovery or whatever it is.
Right. So I'm teaching them how to sculpt. I'm teaching them, as a metaphor, how to do woodwork with a metaphor, and then they create their own. And if they need a little bit of insight, they'll ask me. So I take seriously this idea that we parent the soul of the child, and I oftentimes say, insight is the best gift you can give your child. So let me share with you a pet peeve. Someone will say, well, say thank you to the rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi. So if I feel like, I pull the parent aside, I say, may I offer you a word of advice? I say, yes. I want you to try something different. Say in a quiet moment, do you feel grateful to the rabbi and his wife? Well, for what? Well, look what they did. They prepared this, Yeah, so I feel grateful. Do you feel grateful? Now that you mention it. So what do you do when you feel grateful? Say thank you. Good idea. See, you can say thank you. Yes, ma'am. You haven't given them insight. When you say, hey, I feel grateful to the rabbi and his wife right now. Well, why? And look at all the little things they did, and they can't in the food. And then the kid goes, like they're seeing what happened. And so oftentimes I say, teach the child an insight and let them think of what to do next, as opposed to ordering a kid what to do, how to feel, and how to think. Just a tiny example.
Yeah, well, it's an introduction to an insight, which will now give them a perspective, right? And now that perspective will recreate itself in other areas. Same thing as we were talking about earlier with the feeling. And now they will say, oh, this is like when I was with Rabbi Finley and I felt gratitude and I said, thank you. Well,
Yeah.
here's another version of that. And now the appropriate or the right thing or whatever I should be doing, because I'm feeling this, is
Yes.
say thank you.
That's exactly right. You got it. By the way, it's more often Rabbi Finley's wife. But we'll just metaphorically, put
We'll
my
take, yeah, we'll give you the nod.
Yeah.
I try to instill that in and create that for my children, my sons too. So it's not as easy, but with my daughter, when he's having his moments, I say, all right, we're gonna go and we're gonna breathe, and he does this cute little face, and my daughter, same thing, and we have this little thing called shoe laptop, because she had two incidences where she broke a laptop. And she had a Barbie shoe that she was trying to balance, and she was all energetically frazzled. And I said, step back, take a deep breath.
Yeah.
And Rabbi, I took a Hail Mary. I said, I promise you that the shoe will stand up if you approach it with a calmer energy. And I threw a Hail Mary on that one, and she
Wow.
stood it up, and it stood up perfectly. And I was like, yes.
Great.
And
So that's great.
and when she's
calming and
getting
centering,
yeah,
it's a gift for life.
yeah, and when she gets to those points, I'll say, Emma, shoe laptop. Just give her a little bit of nod that you're going down that path that led to a broken laptop and a non-balanced shoe for Barbie. What can we do in this scenario to ground ourselves and not break the laptop?
You gave a state of consciousness. You gave a state of consciousness and a method to get there with a symbolic name, which you'll remember forever. She knows what's behind it. That's beautiful parenting, man.
Thank you. Thank you. I threw it up on that one, Rabbi. I'm not going to lie. I was like, I promise you that Barbie shoe will stand up. And
good.
Luckily it did. Where can people get your teachings? Where can people learn more? Where can people connect with you? This was tremendous.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation. Well, main thing is rabbifinley.com. He always has a list of my classes. The main way to get to me is through my classes on Wednesday nights. I'll probably expand it to Tuesday nights after the Jewish high holidays. I do my Shabbat teachings on Friday night, Saturday morning. I always put them on Facebook. So, it's not well organized, but we're going to pass the Jewish high holidays. My wife are going to sit down, organize my website, organize my Facebook. And I am assiduously working on finishing a basic summary of my teachings as they apply to interpersonal relationships. It should be a fun, super easy read. And then I'm going to get to the, what I'll call the master book and spiritual psychology of Kabbalah and everything else. So if anybody loves this, come up to my Zoom class. Hopefully I'll expand my website. Look for me on Facebook, and please be patient as we try to get everything up to, to industry standard and until I get my book out. So I really appreciate your inviting me. I'm not quite ready yet for interest. I have enough, but not what I want. And if you have faith in me, I'll get it out there.
Well, I have all the faith in you, and once all those things launch and get up and rolling, I'd love to have you back on to
Yeah, I'd
dive
love
deeper
to.
and dive more. And I'm
I'll
sure,
plug my book.
yeah, please, and I'm sure with Rich Roll and Aubrey Marcus and all and the podcast you're doing, those classes are going to fill up and things are going to start moving on to the next trajectory. So all the best to you. Thank you so much, Rabbi. I really appreciate your time, and this was great.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I appreciate it.
All right, take care.
Take care. Be well.